Hi, I am Glendora Lashley. Welcome to the Talk the Tingz mini podcast. Talk the Tingz is part of the ongoing work by the Lilly Foundation for Human Development to combat gender-based abuse and violence in Tobago. This podcast was made possible with support from the Spotlight Initiative, which is a global partnership between the European Union and the United Nations. Of course, the Spotlight Initiative is working in partnership with the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And in this episode of Talk the Tingz, we are talking with Secretary in the Tobago House of Assembly with responsibility for health, wellness, and social protection, Assemblyman Dr. Faith B.Yisrael. Hi, Dr. Faith.
Hi, Glendora. Thanks for having me. Can I just congratulate you and the Lilly Foundation on this spectacular work that you all have been doing in the Tobago space. Really, really stellar work, and I'm glad to be a part of this project.
All right. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to speak with us. Of course, we are raising awareness around sexual abuse and violence, and we are looking particularly at sexual abuse and violence of boys and girls in Tobago. And so we want to just kind of explore what's happening in the Tobago space. Now, for those of you all listening to this podcast episode, Dr. Faith is recently elected, and so she has taken over this huge responsibility in the THA, this huge division. In a crisis time, we're managing the COVID pandemic, but of course, health is health, wellness is wellness, and social protection is social protection. And so we're going to explore a bit from the policy side to hear from Dr. Faith. And forgive me, but the Tobagonians, we all affectionately refer to our secretary as Dr. Faith. All right. We are going to ask Dr. Faith about the issues as she has come in and met them, what she's aware of, and what is her direction. All right. So Dr. Faith, to start off, have you been able to get any sort of official current situational analysis on sexual abuse of children in Tobago in terms of statistics? Do you have any official statistics? Are we keeping statistics with respect to the sexual abuse of boys and girls in Tobago?
So from my division's perspective, no, we do not have specific statistics. That's a tongue twister. Of course, we know that the Child Protection Unit of the TTPS, they are tasked with responding on the official level to child abuse generally, to child sexual abuse specifically. And they have a statistical unit that does these reports every month, every quarter, every year as relates to the information that's coming out. So no, coming from my division specifically, we do not have data. We simply rely on the data that comes from the TTPS. We all know though that reported cases is usually way less than the actual cases. And that is something that we need to be critical about in terms of how we think about it, in terms of what we do about it, because the numbers that we see certainly do not represent what is actually happening on the ground, because we know that is way more actually happening on the ground. One of the things I would like to probably jump in very quickly, though, outside of the official statistics, is to talk about the psychological mentality that is associated with sexual abuse of boys and girls, or I should say the sexual abuse of boys versus girls in the Tobago space. I had the benefit of, chatting with some young people. As you know, I do quite a lot of sexual health lectures with young people throughout the island.
Yes.
And I had a interesting conversation a couple of weeks ago with a group of young people where we were talking about when is abuse actually abuse. And the typical response, which was an unfortunate situation, is that a 30-year-old man, for example, having sex with a 13-year-old girl, it was very clear that that was abuse. It was very clear that that was, statutory rape, if nothing else, to the team. But when we switched it around and we spoke about a 30-year-old woman having sex with a 13-year-old boy, both the boys and the girls in that group were very clear in their mind that that was not sexual abuse.
Mm.
And that the boys were just, being broken out and they just getting experience early, and it got to have a big woman show them what to do. And I am thinking in 2022, if this is how our young people, and these were 12 to 18, 19-year-olds were in that session, if this is their thinking, that says quite a lot about the number of cases that we will actually see happening, the number of cases that we would actually see reported. So there's a significant chunk of education that is required for us to allow children to be children,
Right.
boys and girls to be children. And I was, honestly, I was a little taken aback by the response of the team, because
Really?
because I thought we had gotten a little past that point.
Wow. Okay. I am happy that you raised that, because a pet peeve of mine in Tobago is, well, and the region really, we don't seem to make the connection. We're all in this fight against violence and abuse against women and girls, and we never really make the connection to the more dominant perpetrator, which is usually boys and men, as to why they do what they do. And you may be aware, but that's really the essence of the work at the Lilly Foundation when we took on this role against combating gender-based abuse and violence. Because just as you pointed out there, many of us in Tobago, block talk, how you grow up, as you put it, the fellas know that it doesn't matter your age, really, maybe unless you're like 5 years old. If a big woman, quote unquote, trouble you, that's Pip's thing. You can have fun. But when it's the other way around, we automatically will see that as abuse. For me, what I find interesting is that link, because I don't know how many grown men you've had this conversation with, but when they speak about years later, hindsight, realizing that what they went through with the older woman, that they had some sort of, that abused them or violated them, was abuse and violence, and how they in turn use that now. Basically, you move from being the victim to being the perpetrator. I don't know if that's something that you have looked at in your private capacity well before you assume the role of secretary, or if it's something when you look at maybe the outlook for your division that you're considering as a policy, as a policy directive or policy initiative.
Yeah, it is something that we are considering. It's something that we've actually just started talking about. As you are very much aware, I did jump into this in the middle of probably the deadliest month of COVID in Tobago. So I am now at the point of having conversations about non-COVID related issues. We're finally at that point where we can talk about other things that's happening in the division. And that is actually a conversation I started having even this week about what are our policies as it relates to gender-based violence generally, as it relates to abuse generally, even within our institution, within the organization, how we treat with abuse, sexually related abuse, whether it's adults, children, and that kind of thing, and how we are going to move forward, because it's we are in a culture where we are so used to being alarmed when it happens, but then realizing one or two of the parties is a relative, a god brother, sister, somebody that you know. So you now have to, switch how you think about what you will do, unfortunately. And we have to move away from that kind of thinking where our familiarities is what prevents us from doing, quote unquote, the right thing. and have strict policies and actually implement those policies. So this week, we actually started talking about that with some of my officers here and what that would really mean. And in essence, the kind of hornet's nest that would raise, when we act, because we are going to act.
Yeah, for somebody who is like not familiar, because unfortunately we do have a lot of Tobagonians that do not truly understand how the THA works, what is the role of the THA, what they can go to the THA for. Just for a bit of information purposes, what is the role of the THA when it comes to sexual abuse, the sexual abuse of minors, of boys and girls in Tobago? What is the specific role, particularly of the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection?
Certainly. So the Division of Health, Wellness and Social Protection is the arm of the Tobago House of Assembly that makes and implements policies as it relates to those three areas: health, wellness, social protection. Maybe it's worth speaking about what social protection is, because that is a new term that we are using for this new administration. Social protection really is allowing our communities to be able to withstand shocks. Now, what are shocks? Shocks are life events. We usually think of shocks as negative things. You lost your job, or there was a death in the family or something like that. Those are shocks. But shocks could also be positive things. You just got married and you now have to live with a person who you had not been living with before, and you don't know how to deal with that. You now have a job where you are making $10,000 more than you made before, and you are going wild, not realizing that you only have a contract for a year, and this might run out sooner than you think. So putting systems in place to allow us to be resilient to shocks, whether they are positive or negative shocks, is what the social protection arm of the division is doing and will continue to do. As relates to the abuse of children specifically, this is the arm where we are most likely to hear about abuse of children, because you may have a situation where a mother comes in and she's coming in for something that is totally unrelated. She's coming in because she's a single mother who needs help getting food or needs help getting a device. And when the social workers do real critical assessment, you realize that she may be in an abusive situation, or the children may be abused themselves, and then we have to act. The thing about it is that in Trinidad and Tobago, the first official call, well, there are two lines. The first official call really is the Children's Authority of Trinidad and Tobago, because they are the entity that is officially responsible for, they're the entity that's officially responsible for managing the response of children. So they can do that. That is the official call that we need to make as it relates to them, to us responding. So that is why I was happy when you said that you are going to have a conversation with the Children's Authority, because according to the laws, there was a host of laws that happened a couple years ago. 2015, I think, is when those laws came into being. Many of them were a little older, but were amended. Basically said that the Children's Authority is the entity that is responsible for, in essence, the nation's children, safeguarding the nation's children. So we have a responsibility to report to the Children's Authority and to also report to the TTPS. Again, the fact that the Child Protection Unit is also a part of the new part of the TTPS, report to them any instance of child abuse that we recognize. And I think that is a critical point that people need to recognize. The law now specifically states that we must report anyone who is in an authoritative responsibility over a child. Once they recognize that there is some level of abuse happening, they are mandated by law to report. Now, it's important to also realize, and I think people need to understand this, that your mandate to report is very different from a mandate to investigate. You are not required to do any investigation. You are not required to do any running up and down and trying to find out information on your own. You are not required to do any of that. You are just required to report to the TTPS and or to the Children's Authority, and then they will continue with the investigation and doing what needs to be done. So I think that is something that is critical for people to understand what their roles and responsibilities lie, because I think in many instances, people are afraid to report because they think that they then need to provide evidence, or they then need to provide proof that what they are saying is true, when in fact that is not the case.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And well, I want to pivot a bit as you raise the issue of reporting, because when you spoke about, let's say, the people who come in for assistance, one of the things that we see a lot in Tobago when it comes particularly to sexual abuse of children, boys and girls, there's that fear of making the report, not necessarily because you're worried about providing evidence, but because you're worried about the person that you are reporting. Usually when it's a male adult, is sometimes, many times, in a breadwinner position, or as you highlighted before, your godbrother, your cousin, your uncle, your sister, your aunt, close relative, close friends. People seem to more easily turn a blind eye to that. What is your position on that?
You know, it's one of those things that I've had to seriously think about, even in my situation. And I've had to actually ask myself, Faith, what would you do? What would you do if somebody really did come to you and say that your favorite uncle abused them? What would be your initial reaction? What would you do? And the reality is, I would probably pause and think to myself, nah, he ain't gonna do that. That would be my initial reaction. And because I know to myself that is a reaction that I would have on my own, it's also important for me to recognize that that is also a normal reaction for other people to have as it relates to their family and their friends. What we need to do, though, is to kind of move beyond that initial reaction, that initial need to protect who you think belongs to you, and recognize that there are much larger implications for the well-being of the person who is or who may be the victim in this situation, and a larger responsibility to those individuals who are vulnerable. And in this case, we're talking about children. Children are vulnerable. Inherently, children are vulnerable just because of their everything about them makes them vulnerable. And that individually, our responsibility is to protecting those who are vulnerable and not necessarily to protect our family members. It's a hard conversation that we need to have with ourselves. It's one that would take quite a bit of support, because you also have to recognize the kind of backlash that happens when people report, or if people recognize that it is known that they report. Again, thinking about my same situation, I could imagine my mother and my cousins and whatever stringing me up if I report that my uncle did something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's a reality that we have to deal with, that people have to then live in their homes, live in their communities, and live with the consequences of what they do. So we have to go back to them, I think, putting better systems in place that would prevent that kind of backlash. Somebody reporting, there's almost no confidentiality when it comes to stuff like this in Tobago. So even if I report, I should be able to report this and no one knows that I reported this.
Yeah.
Because it was done in such a confidential manner that allowed that to happen. And that to me is absolutely critical, that we put the systems in place that would allow for a reporting like that to happen confidentially, and for the person to know that I will not get the backlash, because literally no one will know. That is what I'm.
Now, I know you've come into this at a heavy time, pandemic, COVID response, all the resources really went towards that COVID response, not to mention you came in there as the new secretary with responsibility for health, wellness, and social protection, meeting a bunch of employees who were disgruntled and have been for many years and looking for salaries and so on. But of course, the whole division is not just health, it's not just social protection, it's not just wellness, it's all of them. And I'm asking you this, I'm saying all of that to come to a kind of resources question, in the sense that I know you're now thinking with your team about policy direction, but in terms of thinking about resources, because you see what you said there, I remember when the Children's Authority, before they came to Tobago, when they were doing consultations and so on, and of course the Lilly Foundation for Human Development, we were present. And I had a conversation with, at the time, one of the senior legal associates of the authority. And, you know, they came with all sorts of nice, grand ideas. And I said, hey, listen, this is Tobago. You gotta come to Tobago and remove a child from the house, right? You can't remove them from the home because, one, where are you going to put them? Where are you put them? Who looking after them? Are you causing more harm than good? You know, we have been around long enough. I have seen the jails in Tobago. I've seen all of the homes in Tobago, all of the places they put children, including those that got closed down. I know majority of the personalities, we know the reality. And one of the things that pains me all the time is that in Tobago, we don't necessarily have a safe space in terms of a physical space. If you need to remove a child for a moment, a minor, where do we put them? Is this something that outside of your calls for all of the assistance that you've made calls for, do you realistically see your division being able to maybe attract funding towards that kind of thing? And for everybody listening, this is a long-term plan. Dr. Faith is not a magician. She can't wake up one morning and build a whole new facility. But do you see that as perhaps part of the long-term directive in terms of a necessity for Tobago, that kind of waiting facility, transitionary facility? I don't know what you're going to call it, what's the correct terms, but we need a safe space for children.
And we do need a safe space for children, but I would think about it a little differently though. I think the Tobago House of Assembly has incorrectly taken up the responsibility for too many things that should not be the responsibility of the THA. So for example, something like that, I would actually prefer partnering with an NGO for them to get the funding to do it, and then we will collaboratively, so that it is not the responsibility of the THA to run and manage such a facility. I think that has been one of the errors that we've been making, thinking that the THA needs to do absolutely everything.
Right.
In a shorter term though, I do think that what we can do is actually spend a little bit more time encouraging people to actually sign up to be foster parents and to be adoptive parents, because that is a big chunk of why we have issues in Tobago. We don't have registered foster parents. This concept of being a foster parent is a relatively new one, except that we've kind of been doing it before, you know, when auntie just take the niece because it's a better situation to live with auntie than to stay home. In essence, what this is fostering. But we have not been doing it in an official capacity. And I think that is where the division could probably help the Children's Authority by doing more awareness and encouraging more people to sign up, to go through the courses and to make their homes available, so that if we do have a situation where it really is the best thing to remove the child from the home, we have options where we can place that child safely.
Right.
So I think that is a direction that I would be pushing my social protection department to go with, and to work with the NGOs that are around, probably work on helping people create new NGOs if that is what's necessary, to build out that kind of longer term response that you are talking about, that is needed, but I think needs to be part of the non-government sector as we go forward.
Right, that's excellent to hear. And you know, Dr. Faith, I don't mix my words to give kudos or to criticize. So I have to give you some kudos on that, because I mean, it's in keeping with what you've been doing well before you became a politician and secretary with responsibility for health, wellness, and social protection. But to come on now and embrace, because what you're talking about basically is building on what has been national policy in these recent years, because the minister with responsibility for this nationally, who we will talk to in another episode, she has been championing exactly what you're talking about there. So to hear you come very professionally and say, well, listen, Tobagonians, this is something that we should consider. I got to give you a kudos on that, as usual, but you are no stranger to this kind of action. So that's as an aside, because it is important. I could tell you, you question yourself as to if you will report your uncle, your favorite uncle. I have questioned myself as to if I would ever adopt. And I kid you not, it's a question that I've been faced with, because my daughter is at that stage where I think she feels that she has the right to demand a sibling, and we're just not on the same page, right? So she, right. I don't know what she's been watching on YouTube or whatever, but she asked me, where is the adoption center? I'm like, what adoption center? And she was like, well, since you're not going to have another baby, can we go to an adoption center? So it was a conversation that I actually had to have with an 8-year-old, mind you. But I remember just kind of thinking, would I actually adopt a child? You know, so I like that you raised that, because for every Tobagonian, particularly those young professionals out there who will have the resources and perhaps the flexibility and the mindset, you're hearing it from the professional who has a PhD in or a first degree. Your first degree is in neuroscience or something like that, Dr. Faith?
Yes, it is neuroscience.
Right, and that's the study of the brain, and you know how we're making decisions and that kind of thing. So you're hearing it from somebody who has some expertise in understanding how the brain works, that maybe it's something us, you know, Tobagonians should really consider as a way of helping to develop and build a better, stable society free from abuse and violence, particularly against children, women and girls, everybody. All right. Dr. Faith, I took up so much of your time already, but is there anything that you'd like to share with the Tobago, with Tobagonians especially, as it relates to sexual abuse of boys and girls on this little island?
We need to allow children to be children. I think that we have, because of all of the responsibilities placed on us as adults, we have been taking away that human right from children to allow them to be children. And I think we need to actively think about that and to actively do things to allow them to live as children and to live happy and healthy childhoods. And that means protecting them. That means protecting them within our homes, protecting them outside our homes, protecting them. Sadly, COVID has, in many instances, well, at least now the kids are going back to school. In many instances, COVID took away the safe space for a lot of our children, which were their schools, and forced them to be at home, which may not have been the safest space for them. And we now have to consider that there may be significant repercussions for that coming later down, psychological, psychosocial repercussions for that a little later down, outside of the whole issue of us, you know, not being able to do the kind of education that should have happened in the last 2 years. But the fact that in many instances, we've placed children or we've left children in spaces that was just unsafe for them over the last couple years. And we need to be prepared for that. We need to be financially prepared for that. We need to be emotionally prepared for that. And we need, and I'm almost speaking to myself in this regard, we need to be able to put the systems in place to be able to respond to the fallout that is going to happen as a result of what has happened over the last 2 years of COVID. So it's just something to think about. It's something that we need to be very conscious about. And we need to go back to allowing children to be children. Allow children to be children. When children play, when they run up and down, that is normal. When they're being miserable, that is normal. When they're asking questions, that is normal. We need to allow them to do that.
Yeah.
I think that's what I want to end. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for that. I just want to ask you to make one additional consideration as you all go forward with your policy planning, and that is to lean on your neuroscience background. This is something that I've considered years ago while in England, chatting with an ally of the Lilly Foundation, one of the directors of one of our partner organizations. We had a discussion on the reasoning or the human conditions, mental conditions, chemical conditions, I don't know what sort of conditions, behind behind an adult wanting and actively going to have some sort of sexual interaction with a child. Right? Yeah. I don't know the reason. Many of us assume that part of it is DNA, but then you have the pedophile ring that is as big as ever in Europe. And I don't know if the DNA running so much, but child pornography, child sex is a big thing. It's a big thing worldwide. Our dynamic may be different, but I'd really love to see if we get research. You are scientifically driven, you're data driven. So if you ever get the chance to do it, maybe just having some research in the Tobago space as to what may be some of the causative factors behind an adult having seeking out a sexual interaction with a child. Because I can't see an adult trying to have sex with my child. I've looked at my child from baby to now, and we have babies being sexually abused. We have all ages, right? But when you get to be a teenager, the body develops that kind of thing. You see sexual signs that the body naturally would want to respond to. But when you look a little down, where there's nothing going on,
what could possibly be driving
precisely that? And even with the boys, I want to stick a plug in, because we don't talk about the boys. We have a lot of boys who are sexually abused, and people hide, and then they try to say, well, that might be a homosexual thing or a gay thing, that kind of thing, but we don't know. So it's important to find out. I hope that might be up your alley. I hope it's something you all consider. I know we don't have a whole lot of resources, but maybe it could be one of those partnerships with a university somewhere or something to kind of, start that research, because that would make campaigns like this, responses like this, a bit more effective when we know exactly what sort of the route that we should be looking to get to or to address. Yeah,
certainly.
But thank you very much, Dr. Faith. We've been chatting with Assemblyman Dr. Faith B.Yisrael, who is the Secretary in the Tobago House of Assembly with responsibility for health, wellness, and social protection, on this episode of Talk the Tingz, where we are exploring how to reduce and eliminate gender-based violence, particularly the sexual abuse of boys and girls in Tobago.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, Dr. Faith.